It is descriptive and predictive, but it isn't creative. Newton's law of gravitation doesn't create gravity or the matter in which gravity acts. In fact, it doesn't even explain gravity, as Newton himself saw. But it's even worse, actually. Well, it depends on your perspective, of course. The laws of physics are not only incapable of creating anything, they can't even cause anything to happen. Newton's celebrated laws of motion never caused a pool ball to race across a pool table in the history of the universe. That can only be done by people using a pool cue and the actions of their own muscles. The laws enable us to analyze the motion and to map the trajectory of the ball for the first few bounces anyway, until all sorts of chaotic effects set in, provided nothing external interferes. But the laws are incapable of moving the ball, let alone creating it and the table in the first place. So what can Hawking possibly mean by suggesting that law creates the universe? Now, Paul Davies, with whom I've debated some of these things, a brilliant writer and at ASU in Phoenix, he says there's no need to invoke anything supernatural in the origins of the universe or of life. I've never liked the idea of divine tinkering. For me, it is much more inspiring to believe that a set of mathematical laws can be so clever as to bring all these things into existence. Well, in the world in which most of us live, the simple law of arithmetic, 1 + 1 = 2, never brought anything into being. It certainly has never put any money into my bank account. I wonder, has it done to yours? If I put $1,000 into the bank today and 1,000 tomorrow, the law of arithmetic will tell me I have $2,000. But if I never put any money into the bank myself and leave it to the laws of arithmetic to do it, I shall remain permanently bankrupt. To think that the laws can produce it is like thinking you can create real money by simply doing sums. For every says if you have A, then you will get B. But first catch your A. The laws will not do it for you. So I would submit to you that the world of strict naturalism, in which clever mathematical laws all by themselves bring the universe and life into existence, is pure science fiction. So Hawking has signally failed to answer his main question: why is there something rather than nothing? Alan Sandage, widely regarded as the father of modern astronomy, discoverer of quasars, winner of the Crawford Prize and astronomy's equivalent of the Nobel Prize, is in no doubt about his answer to the question. I find it quite improbable, he wrote, that such order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God to me is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there is something rather than nothing. Let me say some words about the grand design. Like every other physicist, Hawking is confronted with powerful evidence of his design, as he explains in great detail in his book. Our universe and its laws appear to have a design that is both tailor-made to support us, and if we are to exist, leaves little room for alteration. That is not easily explained. So he says, the discovery relatively recently of the extreme fine-tuning of so many of the laws of nature could lead at least some of us back to the old idea that this grand design is the work of some grand designer. That is not the answer of modern science. Our universe seems to be one of many, each with different laws. Now, there are many interesting things about this. First is, Hawking clearly recognizes a grand design. He gave that title to his book. He devotes almost an entire chapter to giving extensive details of spectacular fine-tuning. That certainly fits in with the old idea. But the question to ask is not, is an idea old, but is it true? And the implication often is that by describing an idea as old, it isn't true. And of course, that's nonsense. Some of the best ideas have been around for millennia. Now, Hawking says that the existence of a grand designer is not the answer of modern science. But what can he mean by that? Modern science is a set of disciplines done by modern scientists. Has he forgotten of the existence of Bill Phillips, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics in North America and still is teaching? He believes in the grand designer. Has he forgotten about the existence of Francis Collins, the former director of the Human Genome Project? And I could go on and on. In my own University of Oxford, there are several very distinguished scientists who, in common with Newton, Kepler, Galileo, and all the rest of them, believe that the reason we can do science at all is because it reflects the operation of a mind. That's a very old idea, of course, but it nonetheless a very powerful idea. So Hawking is going totally beyond the evidence to say that is not the idea of modern science. But his idea of what the answer is a multiverse, and he immediately makes the category mistake again. God of the multiverse. But God can create as many universes as he likes, can't he? How is a multiverse in itself an argument against the existence of a creator? Hawking certainly hasn't addressed that question, as many philosophers have not been slow to point out. Again, the easy slip into the false dichotomy, so that it means instinctively that if a scientist takes God seriously, they're not allowed to take the multiverse seriously. That's a very clever get-out, but it seems to me it won't do. Now, with his multiverse, Hawking moves beyond science, of course. As Paul Davies points out, all cosmological models are constructed by augmenting the results of observation by some sort of philosophical principle. Now, Hawking, as we saw, claims to be the voice of modern science, but as I read, I discover that there are other powerful voices disagreeing. For instance, Sir Roger Penrose, Hawking's former collaborator. His response to the book has been fascinating. Of the use of the multiverse, Penrose says it's overused. He doesn't like the term because it's inaccurate. And then he goes on to say about this M theory that Hawking claims is the unified theory that Einstein was expecting to find. Penrose says it is very far from testability. And he points out that Hawking's book is misleading. It gives you this impression of a theory that's going to explain everything. It is nothing of the sort. It is not even a theory. And Penrose's verdict is that M theory is hardly science. And we might observe that he is a member of the British Humanist Society. He is not a theist. Now, what's interesting to me about this is, one, the existence of multiverses isn't in itself an argument against God, so we can set that aside. But for Hawking to claim that this is the answer, with voices as strong as Penrose's, seemed to me to, well, I would want to wait a little while before I made such a strong assertion. And indeed, one of Hawking's students, Don Page, who's an eminent theoretical physicist now in the University of Alberta, wrote to me, I wrote to him about a letter he put in the Times, and he responded this way, and he's allowed me to quote it for you. I certainly would agree that even if M theory were a fully formulated theory, which it isn't yet, and were correct, which of course we don't know, that would not imply that God did not create the universe. I can't help sharing with you this marvelous review that appeared in one of our national newspapers. In this very brief history of modern cosmological physics, the laws of quantum and relativistic physics represent things to be wondered at, but widely accepted, just like biblical miracles. M theory invokes something different, a prime mover, a begetter, a creative force that is everywhere and nowhere. This force cannot be identified by instruments or examined by comprehensible mathematical prediction, and yet it contains all possibilities. It incorporates omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence, and it's a big mystery. Remind you of anybody? A move to advance the cause of atheism, ladies and gentlemen, by means of a highly speculative, untestable theory, which even if it were true, could not dislodge God in any sense, is not exactly calculated to impress those of us whose faith in God is not speculative, but is based on evidence-based rational thought. And I conclude with this. Much of the rationale behind Hawking's and other arguments lies in the idea that there's a deep-seated conflict between science and religion. This is not a discord that I recognize. In fact, I'd go further than that. I've had the privilege to work with two very distinguished historians of science in my career, Professor John Brooke and his successor, Professor Peter Harrison at Oxford. And what is very interesting, that with all kinds of nuances that can be made by the expert historians, one interesting focal point of history has been the explosive rise of science as we know it, that is modern science, in the 16th and 17th centuries. And C.S. Lewis got it pretty right, it seems to me, in the opinion of these experts, when he wrote these words. Men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, far from belief in God hindering science, it was the very motor that drove it. Now, identifying science as a rational activity helps me, it seems, to point up very clearly another very serious flaw in Hawking's thinking. Like Francis Crick, he wants us to believe that human beings are nothing but mere collections of fundamental particles of nature. In his reductionism, he reduces biology to physics and chemistry and concludes, it is hard to see how free will can operate if our behavior is determined by physical law. So it seems we are no more than biological machines, and that free will is just a delusion. It's logical. But rather than me comment on the philosophy of it, let's allow John Polkinghorne, who taught me quantum physics at Cambridge many years ago, to comment on it. In the opinion of many thinkers, Polkinghorne writes, human freedom is closely connected with human rationality. If we were deterministic beings, what would validate the claims that our utterance constituted rational discourse? Would not the sounds issuing from mouths or the marks we made on paper simply be the actions of automata? And he concludes, all proponents of deterministic theories, whether social and economic, Marx, or sexual, Freud, or genetic, Dawkins and E.O. Wilson, need a covert disclaimer on their own behalf, accepting their own contribution from reductive dismissal. Hawking seems to qualify to be added to the list. And I conclude by saying this. It may surprise you. My chief objection to the kind of atheism that Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow put in their book, my chief objection to it does not arise from the fact that I am a Christian. It arises from the fact that I believe that it's possible to do science. And it seems to me that their reductive arguments undermine the credibility of the rationality in which all scientists believe as a fundamental postulate in order to do science. And if I'm faced with two explanations of the universe, one that says in the end my mind is my brain and my brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process, as philosophers in increasing numbers are beginning to see, well, it's obvious anyway, why on earth would you trust an instrument of searching and knowledge that was constructed on the basis of a mindless, unguided process? In other words, this reductive atheism of the new atheistic type seems to me to undermine the very rationality that we do science with. In other words, their articulations are meaningless on the basis of their own theories. Makes much more sense to me, ladies and gentlemen, that the reason that we can do science, at least the reason that my little mind in here can understand a little bit of the big universe out there, is because ultimately both are traceable back to the same grand designer. Thank you very much.